Scorched earth due to the constant shelling of the Russian army and broken houses. This is how one of the residential districts of the frontline Bakhmut looks like now. Zabakhmutka is located near the industrial part of the city. The Russian invaders attack this area several times a day.
Over decades in power, the Putin regime has mastered how to manipulate the emotions of Russians. To doubt the effectiveness, no need. Here is the interception of a telephone conversation between a Russian soldier and his mother. A man is scared and wants to run away from the front line, but mother is against it.
I am Mikhailov Taras, born September 8, 1978. In Bevölkerung, Krasnodar Krai, was convicted in 2005 by 105/72 and 162/84 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation.
Good health to you, fellow Ukrainians. On October 23rd, we can already report that in all our regions, which became the target of yesterday's Russian terrorist attack, the technical possibility of electricity supply has been restored. I am thankful to each and everyone who worked tirelessly to bring light to people.
Він кардинально міняє насправді лінію, тому що за рахунок великої дистанції висоти ми бачимо противника і його майбутні рухи. Тобто, куди машини їхні, куди їде їхня машина, до якої посадки, кількість піхоти в посадці можемо замітити. Тобто він дійсно допомагає і міняє лінію.
Якби не було його, то як би тоді?
Добрий день.
А що це ви тягнете?
Дрова.
А куди?
А ми там топимо печку.
Ukraine has invited officials from the UN's nuclear watchdog to examine its facilities after Russia accused it of planning to use an explosive laced with radioactive material.
The briefing is devoted to the exposure of fakes and the information war waged by the aggressor state against Ukraine. Let's start with the fact that over the last few days, Russia has been conducting a massive information and psychological special operation in order to accuse Ukraine of allegedly intending to use the so-called dirty bomb.
Die Ukraine und westliche Länder widersprechen vehement. Dennoch beharrt Russland darauf, Kiew wolle eine sogenannte schmutzige, also radioaktiv verseuchte Bombe einsetzen. Russische Staatsmedien behaupten, sie sei fast fertig. Die Ukraine und westliche Länder widersprechen vehement. Dennoch beharrt Russland darauf, Kiew wolle eine sogenannte schmutzige, also radioaktiv verseuchte Bombe einsetzen. Russische Staatsmedien behaupten, sie sei fast fertig.
News about Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kherson direction made the Ukrainian front the primary subject of the discussions again. Of course, there are many questions. How quickly can Ukraine regain control of the city? Will Russia retreat as it was before, or will it fight for every stone?
Scorched earth due to the constant shelling of the Russian army and broken houses. This is how one of the residential districts of the frontline Bakhmut looks like now. Zabakhmutka is located near the industrial part of the city. The Russian invaders attack this area several times a day.
They shell 20 times a day. It has calmed down for now. The Russian occupiers will bring shells or something like that, like a complex of them, and shelling will start all over again in 30 minutes. Cluster and artillery munitions. They shell with everything.
People may still be under the rubble after another rocket attack on multi-story buildings in this area, but it is impossible to clear it because of the threat of shelling by the Russian invaders. Those residents who continue to live here almost do not come out of shelters. The whole basement was shaking terribly. This door jammed, we could not open it. While the man did open it, it was scary. At the moment, about 300 people remain in the basement, and only now they began to agree to evacuate because of the intensified activity of the Russian army.
See you.
Say hello to your family. God bless you. Viktor's family has long been evacuated to another region. The man has stayed here to help the elderly neighbors.
You know, you'd better ask the elderly. It's more difficult for them. I regard this as a betrayal on my part. I'm abandoning people here, so it's sad and unfortunate that I have to leave them.
It is not easy to take people out of here and deliver humanitarian aid to the city. Almost all river crossings have been destroyed and there's a constant threat of shelling.
The situation is very difficult because there is constant shelling. People have gathered here now because we'd brought pot-belly stoves and bread. Now people will take the bread and return to the basements in the evening, which are located in the school. It is very cold and damp there. People, despite certain narratives, are ready to leave the city. They are ready to look for new housing, for a new life on the liberated territory of Ukraine. They understand several people are wounded and killed every day. Volunteers always risk their lives by coming here. After a while, I think it will be very soon. There will be no passage to Zabakhmutka.
Only last week, 11 civilians were killed in Bakhmut. The city's infrastructure is falling into ruins. On Sunday morning, the Russian army shelled Bakhmut multidisciplinary intensive care hospital. This time, no casualties were reported. Reported by Diana Kolesnik, Olena Gramova, UATV News.
Over decades in power, the Putin regime has mastered how to manipulate the emotions of Russians. To doubt the effectiveness, no need. Here is the interception of a telephone conversation between a Russian soldier and his mother. A man is scared and wants to run away from the front line, but mother is against it. Not so much her coldness as her argumentation is shocking.
You are working off a past life now. In a past life you had a betrayal of your homeland. In a past life it is in your map that you are now in the hot spot. Because you had a betrayal of your homeland. To run away from your duty, if you already stepped in it, that's a serious violation. Interception of a telephone conversation.
This dialogue shows well that many Russians are exposed to Kremlin manipulation. A sense of shame is Putin's favorite trick.
The feeling that the Kremlin wanted to evoke is a feeling of duty that you owe because you are a citizen of Russia. No one cares whatever the person wanted it or not, people choose this war or not. A plan clear for the fact that there is some idea of Putin and people are just like cannon fodder.
And for those who do not want to die for Putin, the old Soviet propaganda trick, the board of shame. Here is one of them in the Stavropol Krai, 30 photos and more than 200 names of those who refuse to go to a war. The same situation is in Aleisk, in Altai Krai. There, in 35th Motorized Rifle Brigade, 260 of the 3,500 military refused to fight in Ukraine. This is how the leadership wanted to motivate the soldiers.
There is a board of shame. It is located in the subdivisions. We have not placed it in the city yet, but we will definitely place it, believe me. Oleg Korotkevich, acting commander of the 41st Combined Arms Army.
The Kremlin applies the same tricks to mobilized men in Russia, presses on a feeling of duty. A special tool of suggestion and influence is the Russian Orthodox Church.
If someone is motivated by a feeling of duty, he goes to do what duty tells him to do. He sacrifices himself for others.
But in reality, there is no duty to the motherland or sacrifice. The Kremlin sends Russians to their death in a foreign country only for the imperial ambitions, and some are already beginning to understand it. Here is an epiphany from one of the Russian airborne units.
At the age of 18, I had to go to the army. I went to the army on these waves of our patriotism and everything else. I was brainwashed, like everyone else, that someone wants to destroy us.
After fighting in Ukraine, he fled from Russia to France. Already there, right at the airport, he tore up his passport and military ID, realizing how many years the Kremlin had deceived him.
No one is obliged to dictate how you act, how you live. You have the right to choose what to do yourself, with whom to communicate and what decision to make. If you are already at the front, there is no shame in surrendering.
just like hiding from mobilization, to hide, to ignore summonses and charges.
If you are afraid that you will become a traitor to your homeland, okay, this fear is also understandable and it is subjective. But why do you need that homeland where they tell you that you are bad because you don't want to go for us to kill? What value is it then in general? What is the value in a country where people's lives are worth nothing?
It is possible and necessary to resist Kremlin manipulation. It is necessary to understand who or what caused the emotions. Are these your own thoughts or are they imposed by someone else? And for this, it is necessary to begin analyzing information from various sources, not only from Russian propagandists. Reported by Serhiy Kulyas, Ksenia Barvinenko, UATV News.
I am Mikhailov Taras, born September 8, 1978, in Bevölkerung, Krasnodar Krai. Was convicted in 2005 by 105/72 and 162/84 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation for a term of 18.5 years. On the third day I was taken out of the prison in Tver, where I served my sentence. I was brought to the Lugansk People's Republic with 108 other prisoners. Having received uniforms and food a day later, we were taken to the training ground. Thereafter, from Sunday to Monday, it was attacked twice by rockets, and one of them landed there. We were urgently evacuated in panic to another city, where military unit 08807 was deployed. After that, we were divided and taken to a pigsty, and then further. The next day I was wounded by the Russian troops, because the Russian troops carried out shelling at the place of our reconnaissance group. I received shell shock. I was wounded on 2 legs and the arm. I don't know how I got out on the field from that runway. I don't remember. After that I was taken by Ukrainian soldiers and brought here. Russian troops shelled your position with artillery. They knew you were there, didn't they? What was the mood in your unit? Someone felt like fighting, others didn't. To be honest, I didn't want to go. I'm a person with disabilities of the second group since childhood. I have a mental disorder. The operatives ordered me to go. I shouldn't be in prison for 17 years. They were tired of me there. What did you do? So I went to the war with my military ticket, where I am a grenade launcher, but I am a shooter. What provision did you have? Food, uniforms, weapons and Kalashnikov rifles, 74 and 47. Do you have a family? No family, I'm homeless. The military equipment was at the base, 3 sheds. We had 108 people from different regions of the Russian Federation. There were people from Kaluga, Voronezh, Ryazan, Tver, Rostov and other regions. We were first transported in paddy wagons, prisoner transport vehicles, to Voronezh. From Voronezh we were taken to Rostov. From Rostov we were put in paddy wagons and taken to places not familiar to me, and we crossed Luhansk and Donetsk borders with Rostov. We arrived at the base at 2 a.m. The head of the base was a military with a call sign Thunderstorm. He had an assistant with a call sign Anthracite. I don't know their names, only call signs. How do you feel about war? Bad. There shouldn't be a war at all. You need to be peaceful people rather than fight. Who's to blame? What do you think? Putin Vladimir is to blame for this, because he wanted to take over the territory of Ukraine for himself. Crimea was not enough for him, and he began to continue offensive operations in relation to other Ukrainian territories, meaning the total invasion of Ukraine. Guys, I'm talking to those who are now on the territory of the Russian Federation. Do not listen to Putin's regime. Stay where you are. Here our people are killing their own. I received shell shock, and now I'm in captivity where I'm treated well, by the way. Don't come here, please don't. Stay at home with your families.
The Russian invaders are probably preparing to blow up the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station. Analysts of the American Institute for the Study of War came to this conclusion. The Russians' goal is to flood the coastal area and widen the Dnipro River in order to delay any Ukrainian military counteroffensive. At the same time, Russia is evacuating the residents of Kherson from the right to the left bank. They withdraw their elite units, officers and their families from there.
They, the Russians, perform certain manipulations with the water that they are trying to drain from the reservoirs. They continue the blackmail that the Ukrainian armed forces are allegedly going to inflict a critical blow on the HPP itself, but it was they who mined the critical infrastructure facility, and it was they who fired all Ukrainian workers, leaving only their trusted specialized personnel. It was they who limited access to this object and strengthened its regime. Natalia Humenyuk, head of the Joint Press Center of the Operational Command South, on the air of the Ukrainian National Telethon.
The dam connects the two banks of the Dnipro River in the Kherson region, and it keeps about 18 million cubic meters of water in the reservoir. If the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station is blown up, all the water will rush downstream. According to the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, in the flood zone there will be more than 80 settlements, including Kherson itself. Undermining the dam will mean a large-scale catastrophe. Of course, we understand that the occupiers are indifferent to what will happen to the territory of Ukraine. With this act of terrorism, they can destroy, among other things, the supply of water from the Dnipro River to the Crimea. The North Crimean Canal, in the event of the destruction of the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, will simply cease to exist. Also, according to Volodymyr Zelenskyy, such a terrorist attack by Russia could leave the water tanks for cooling the reactors of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant without water. As a result, this can lead to its complete stop, with the impossibility of restarting. But undermining the dam of the Kakhovka reservoir is not beneficial for the Russians themselves, experts say, since the water will flood the left bank to a greater extent, where the invaders are evacuating at the moment. It is not profitable for the occupiers to simply blow up the dam, because now their main positions are located in the potentially flooded places. All their equipment, which is now shelling Mykolaiv and even Ochaki from the Kinburn pit, will either be flooded or sucked in by swampy sands. At the same time, different experts confirm that if Russian troops still go to undermine the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, two districts of Kherson will be seriously affected. The shockwave of water will wash away the nearest settlements on the left bank of the Dnipro, but the water level stabilizes rather quickly, which is also unprofitable for the occupiers. The destruction will be severe. The destruction will be exactly on the bank on which the Russian troops will be located, and this is possible in only one case, if they are deeply evacuated through the Crimea and from there to the region of the Krasnodarsky Krai, when they have no plans to even defend Crimea, because in 5 days all these processes will pass, the water will subside, and a direct road to Crimea will be opened for the armed forces of Ukraine. From a military point of view, these are all rather absurd decisions. To prevent Russia from committing its plans to blow up the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, Ukraine calls on an international monitoring mission to take control of the situation, to return Ukrainian personnel to the strategic facility and ensure immediate and professional demining of the aggregates and the dam. Reported by Pavel Stelmach, Natalia Husak, Volodymyr Shtengelov, UATV News.
Бажаю здоров'я, шановні українці. Сьогодні вже можемо прозвітувати, що в усіх наших регіонах
Good health to you, fellow Ukrainians. On October 23rd, we can already report that in all our regions, which became the target of yesterday's Russian terrorist attack, the technical possibility of electricity supply has been restored. I am thankful to each and everyone who worked tirelessly to bring light to people. Of course, in many cities and districts, our energy companies have to apply stabilization shutdown schedules. This is done so that all our people have access to energy, in conditions where it is not possible to produce it in sufficient quantities. Restoring energy facilities destroyed by terrorist attacks is a much longer and more difficult task, but over time we will provide that too. Over time. This time must be past. Therefore, on October 23rd and in the future, as before, we should consume electricity very consciously. Please remember to limit the use of unnecessary and energy-consuming appliances. Separately, I want to address community leaders and mayors of our cities. Please make sure that energy is not wasted. Now is definitely not the time for bright shop windows and signs. It is necessary to be really fragile with energy consumption in public space. Reconstruction continues in the deoccupied territory. Every day I receive new reports about the connection to gas, water, electricity of hundreds of households in liberated areas. In particular, just on October 23rd, in only 2 districts of the Kharkiv region, 346 households have gas again. The city of Vovchansk, 750 more households with electricity. The city of Izium, 300 more households with electricity. This is constant work that does not stop for a single day and continues throughout the liberated territory of Ukraine. Wherever Russia has brought death and degradation, we are restoring normal life. This is precisely about Ukrainians. Where Ukraine is, life is never destroyed. But whenever Russia comes, it leaves behind mass graves, torture chambers, destroyed cities and villages, mined land, destroyed infrastructure and natural disasters. So, when on October 23rd the Russian Minister of Defense organizes a phone carousel and calls foreign ministers with stories about the so-called dirty nuclear bomb, everyone understands everything well, understands who is the source of everything dirty that can be imagined in this war. It was Russia who blackmailed with the radiation disaster at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is the trajectory of Russian missiles that goes in particular over Ukrainian nuclear facilities. Those are Russian troops who mined the dam and aggregates of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant and are blackmailing with their detonation. It is Russia that uses phosphorus munitions, banned anti-personnel mines and the entire range of weapons against civilian infrastructure. Ukraine is always about recovery, always about life, and there's only one subject who can use nuclear weapons in our part of Europe. And this subject is the one who ordered Comrade Shoigu to call somewhere. If Russia calls and says that Ukraine is illegally preparing something, it means one thing. Russia has already prepared all this. I believe that now the world should react in the toughest possible way. If Russia has prepared another round of raising stakes and another escalating step, it must see now, preemptively, and before it's any new dirt, that the world will not swallow that. Even the very Russian threat of nuclear weapons, and even more so against our country, which has given up its nuclear arsenal under promises of security from the largest nuclear powers, is a reason for both sanctions and even greater strengthening of support for Ukraine, because the stronger the support for us is, the sooner this war and any possible Russian threats will end. When a terrorist state raises the stakes, it must feel that it won't work. During the upcoming week, this will be the #1 task for our diplomats, to explain what is happening, and I am sure the world will be with us. The world will understand. It is very important that on October 23rd, the 6th ship with food chartered in the framework of the UN World Food Programme left our port. This vessel is bound for Yemen with wheat. Ethiopia, Yemen and Afghanistan are 3 countries that have already received food thanks to our exports and the UN Food Programme. Such programs are exactly what we in Ukraine are thinking about, how to help get out of the crisis, not how to create a crisis, how to help solve a problem, not how to drive someone into a problem, how to restore the destroyed, not to destroy even more. This is what distinguishes Ukraine from Russia. This is what will help us win in the end, because we fight and work for life. Glory to Ukraine.
Ми воюємо і працюємо заради життя. Слава Україні!
Наступну давай. Бігом, давай дві, бігом.
Єбали. Димить, да, димить. Фокус де, блядь.
Огонь!
Секунду.
І ще зніми, як хлопці дивляться.
Да. Єбали. Є, БК пішло, блядь.
Просто цей дрон надає можливість бути більшості назаді і більш в безпечності.
Він кардинально міняє насправді лінію, тому що з рахунок великої дистанції висоти ми бачимо противника і його майбутні рухи. Тобто, куди машина їхня, куди їде їхня машина, до якої посадки, кількість піхоти в посадці можемо замітити. Тобто він дійсно допомагає і міняє лінію.
Якби не було його, то як би тоді?
Це гарне питання. Радіємо, що він у нас є зараз.
Зараз ми їх щолкнемо. Міномет координуємо з нашого БПЛА з Матрикса. Позиція доповідає, що бачить роботу міномета, бо, наприклад, що піхота там щось підвозить, вона зразу нам передає координати.
А що це за міномет?
89. Де поставлено?
А в мирному житті ким були?
Менеджер з продажі страхування життя.
Як символічно у вас зараз робота склалася в армії.
Ну так співпало, що треба всіх застрахувати. Ні, на білу лінію постав. До 90 було. Реставрировано. Багато з нього вистрілів можна зробити. Тому що радянські там до 20 тисяч вистрілів можна зробити, цього безліч. Ну, але в загальному може бути таке, що він може 2 рази стрілити, а може бути і 50-60 тисяч. Цей італійський міномет гарний, його дистанція 9, там 3,5 кілометра ми можемо доставати. Більш точніше, як попередні судепівські варіанти. Ну, ним просто легше навіть бусоль виставляти. Ми завжди надіємося, що прийдуть якісь демотивовані зразу росіяни, які зрозуміють, що вони приїхали на нашу землю, що їм тут нема що робити. Але завжди ми стикаємося з тим, що вони пускають піхоту як м'ясо. У нас на полі лежить безліч російських солдат, які просто там лежать і їх ніхто не забирає. Приціл вже я віддав.
Over decades in power, the Putin regime has mastered how to manipulate the emotions of Russians. To doubt the effectiveness, no need. Here is the interception of a telephone conversation between a Russian soldier and his mother. A man is scared and wants to run away from the front line, but mother is against it. Not so much her coldness as her argumentation is shocking.
You are working off a past life now. In a past life you had a betrayal of your homeland. In a past life it is in your map that you are now in the hot spot. Because you had a betrayal of your homeland. To run away from your duty, if you already stepped in it, that's a serious violation. Interception of a telephone conversation.
This dialogue shows well that many Russians are exposed to Kremlin manipulation. A sense of shame is Putin's favorite trick.
The feeling that the Kremlin wanted to evoke is a feeling of duty that you owe because you are a citizen of Russia. No one cares whatever the person wanted it or not, people choose this war or not. A plan clear for the fact that there is some idea of Putin and people are just like cannon fodder.
And for those who do not want to die for Putin, the old Soviet propaganda trick, the board of shame. Here is one of them in the Stavropol Krai, 30 photos and more than 200 names of those who refuse to go to a war. The same situation is in Aleisk in Altai Krai. There, in 35th Motorized Rifle Brigade, 260 of the 3,500 military refused to fight in Ukraine. This is how the leadership wanted to motivate the soldiers.
There is a board of shame. It is located in the subdivisions. We have not placed it in the city yet, but we will definitely place it, believe me. Oleg Korotkevich, acting commander of the 41st Combined Arms Army.
The Kremlin applies the same tricks to mobilized men in Russia, presses on a feeling of duty. A special tool of suggestion and influence is the Russian Orthodox Church.
If someone is motivated by a feeling of duty, he goes to do what duty tells him to do. He sacrifices himself for others.
But in reality, there is no duty to the motherland or sacrifice. The Kremlin sends Russians to their death in a foreign country only for the imperial ambitions, and some are already beginning to understand it. Here is an epiphany from one of the Russian airborne units.
At the age of 18, I had to go to the army. I went to the army on these waves of our patriotism and everything else. I was brainwashed, like everyone else, that someone wants to destroy us.
After fighting in Ukraine, he fled from Russia to France. Already there, right at the airport, he tore up his passport and military ID, realizing how many years the Kremlin had deceived him.
No one is obliged to dictate how you act, how you live. You have the right to choose what to do yourself, with whom to communicate and what decision to make. If you are already at the front, there is no shame in surrendering.
Just like hiding from mobilization, to hide, to ignore summonses and charges.
If you are afraid that you will become a traitor to your homeland, okay, this fear is also understandable, and it is objective. But why do you need that homeland where they tell you that you are bad because you don't want to go for us to kill? What value is it then in general? What is the value in a country where people's lives are worth nothing?
It is possible and necessary to resist Kremlin manipulation. It is necessary to understand who or what caused the emotions. Are these your own thoughts, or are they imposed by someone else? And for this, it is necessary to begin analyzing information from various sources, not only from Russian propagandists. Reported by Serhiy Kulyas, Ksenia Barvinenko, UATV News.
Ukraine has invited officials from the UN's nuclear watchdog to examine its facilities after Russia accused it of planning to use an explosive laced with radioactive material. Russia's defense minister reportedly voiced concerns during phone calls with his British, French and Turkish defense ministers. Moscow has not provided evidence to back its claims. Harry Fawcett has more from Kyiv.
Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has made exactly that invitation to the head of the IAEA, saying that inspectors should come in to try to disprove these claims coming from Russia. Obviously, that in itself is not an easy thing to arrange in the midst of a war. A previous visit to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant took some time to arrange. But what he says is that the IAEA urgently needs to send experts to peaceful facilities in Ukraine, which Russia deceitfully claims to be developing a dirty bomb, adding that we have nothing to hide. Now, this adds to a raft of denials and counter-accusations, indeed, from the Ukrainians, saying that this is the kind of thing Russia says ahead of an event that it's planning to do itself. And we've had similar reactions coming from various Western governments. The United Kingdom, United States and French foreign ministers released a statement late on Sunday saying that these were transparently false claims, and just in the last few minutes that's been added to by the German defense minister, saying that any use of such a dirty bomb would cross all red lines. However, the Russians are continuing to push this line. Just in the last few minutes, the Russian Defense Ministry again saying that it has data showing that a dirty bomb or a low-yield nuclear device is in the works by the Ukrainians as a provocation against Russia.
Well, I said Beggs, live for us in Kryvyi Rih in central Ukraine. All of this, of course, happening against the backdrop of the ongoing fighting that is happening. Talk us particularly about what's happening in Kherson.
Well, it's very difficult to get a real sense of what's taking place in Kherson. The Ukrainian authorities have been very strict about what information gets out. They've put in a media blackout, and it's very difficult, impossible in fact, to get access to many of those areas. Now, what we have been seeing previously is that Russian forces have been evacuating civilians from Kherson, and there was talk of a possible military withdrawal. Now, the Ukrainian military intelligence has come out and said, no, that's not the case, that the Russian forces are not retreating, they're not withdrawing. In fact, the Ukrainians say the Russians are bringing in new military units and are preparing the streets for a defense of the city. Now, obviously, Kherson in the south of the country is very strategically important to Russia, but also politically important, since they annexed those areas and claimed that these are parts of Russia, and the loss of that city would be politically and strategically major for Moscow. Now, elsewhere in the country, the Ukrainians say that Russia continues to target civilian infrastructure, saying that since the 10th of October, around 45 energy facilities have been damaged. And the energy provider here has introduced electricity restrictions across the country, in many regions across the country, and says that about 40% of the energy infrastructure has been damaged. Now, obviously, that's a major concern going into winter.
While the fighting continues, of course, so does the propaganda war as well. The Russians have been making some claims against the Ukrainians. Just talk us through what they've been saying.
Well, last week there were claims about each side blaming each other for possibly wanting to blow up the dam, which have caused major flooding. But now we're talking about these claims of a dirty bomb. The Russians have really been pushing this line, saying that the Ukrainians are preparing a dirty bomb or a low-yield nuclear weapon. Now, the Defense Ministry has come out and doubled down on that and said that it's preparing its military, its people that are operating in Ukraine. They say that they're alerting them to operate in radioactive contamination conditions. Now, Russia's foreign minister has also, Sergei Lavrov, has said that Ukraine has the institutions to prepare a dirty bomb, and the Russians are claiming that Ukraine will accuse Russia of using weapons of mass destruction and launch a campaign to undermine Moscow. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has said that they know the entity that would use a nuclear weapon. They're pointing their fingers at Russia, but also the chief of NATO has said that these claims are absurd, and it's a pattern that they've seen Russia go throughout this war. So, but obviously this talk of nuclear weapons or dirty bomb is hugely concerning for Ukrainians as well as Western powers.
Asad, thank you very much indeed, Asad Beg, talking to us from central Ukraine.
Greetings, friends. The briefing is devoted to the exposure of fakes and the information war waged by the aggressor state against Ukraine. Let's start with the fact that over the last few days, Russia has been conducting a massive information and psychological special operation in order to accuse Ukraine of allegedly intending to use the so-called dirty bomb. This scenario unfolds according to all the laws of the genre. At first, unnamed so-called anonymous sources of the Russian state agency RIA Novosti reported that Ukraine seems to have such an intention. After that, this message began to be replicated by bloggers who appear on Russian propaganda sites with a similar information message. For example, on the Russia Today channel, the so-called expert of the Center for Military and Political Journalism, Boris Rozhin, stated that it seems that Ukraine is going to create a so-called dirty bomb to simulate a Russian nuclear strike on Ukraine with the aim of accusing Russia. Then, Defense Minister Shoigu gets more involved, calling the defense ministers of Britain, France, the United States and Turkey with a similar message, but without direct language, only mentioning this alleged intention of the Ukrainian side. Well, then there is information from the first person, the Speaker of the State Duma, Volodin, who claims the same fake news about the alleged preparation of this very dirty bomb by Ukraine. The Kiev regime instructed nuclear scientists to create a dirty bomb, continues to shell the critical infrastructure of nuclear power plants, provoking a humanitarian catastrophe, the Speaker of the Russian parliament claims, an official person in Russia. After that, according to logic, similar messages should be spread by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the President of Russia himself, in order for the informational psychological special operation to be framed in a full circle of this information fake. Ukraine did not plan, did not create and will not create any dirty bombs, but it is being done with a single purpose, a typical preparation for a false flag operation, as Russia constantly does when it accuses those against whom itself creates these criminal intentions. Therefore, Ukraine's position remains unchanged. The West must take these statements very seriously and prevent any use of weapons of mass destruction against Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Russia itself, the real face of the main propagandists is shown. They show the nature of this war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. This is genocide. In particular, their official journalist and blogger Anton Krasovsky speaks on the official state channel, declaring to the whole world that it turns out that Ukrainian children should simply be killed. He said this while commenting on the statement that Ukrainians consider the territory captured by Russia to be occupied. What did the official Russian state blogger say about this? "We had to drown such people," he said that. "The Muscovites have occupied us, and you immediately throw them into the river." This is a quote. Another quote: "We should lock these children in a spruce house and then burn them." This is a direct speech, I repeat, of an official state Russian propagandist who speaks with such a presentation on official state Russian channels. This confirms that Russia is waging genocide against Ukraine, and this requires the harshest reaction from the civilized world. In addition to Krasovsky, Russian state propaganda continues to use discredited speakers who spread completely propagandistic narratives. Once again, the so-called supposedly American former intelligence officer Scott Ritter appeared on the air of Russian state propaganda television, promoting the information that Russia needs. Let me just remind you that this alleged former intelligence officer was previously convicted on the territory of the USA of crimes of a sexual nature and even served a sentence. There is nothing surprising in it, because none of the adequate people agreed to speak on the side of Russia. Next, Russia continues the information war, claiming that Ukraine uses foreign mercenaries to supposedly liberate the occupied territories, while Russia itself uses mercenaries from among its prisoners, to whom it frankly claims. For them, it is a one-way ticket. All they go to the war and die or remain in prison. So, state propagandists claim that about 200 foreign mercenaries, American and British Marines, have been trained by NATO curators for the liberation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is a lie designed to serve one purpose: to justify Russia's military defeats on the battlefield and to repeat the narrative that Russia is fighting on the territory of Ukraine, not with Ukraine but with NATO countries. At the same time, there is an anecdote on this topic: that NATO has not yet even entered the war. Of course, there are no mercenaries from NATO countries on the territory of Ukraine, and this information is another information dump. The use of the argument in favor of the mobilization to the Russian army by Russian propagandists also draws attention. In addition to convicts, people who do not pay alimony are also offered to be taken there. This confirms what we already knew. For Russians, serving in the army and fighting against Ukraine is by no means an honorable mission, but a punishment. In particular, a certain producer, Joseph Prigozhin, quotes himself on the broadcast of the Strana 5 channel: "If a person is not ready to take responsibility for children, then let him pay his debt to the state." He supported the idea of sending alimony workers to the front. And finally, the traditional confirmation that Russian propaganda is trying to shift the responsibility for future energy supply problems in Europe onto the Europeans themselves and their governments. Thus, Russian propaganda began to publish invitations to so-called Russian cultural centers on the territory of European countries in order to, quote, warm up there, because the temperature in the homes of Europeans will be lower than expected due to the energy crisis provoked by Russia itself. A typical tactic: the rapist invites the victim to visit him. There can be only one answer: Russian cultural centers are not about culture, but about espionage, in particular as the FBI once established, which accused the head of the Russian cultural center in Washington of espionage. The traditional appeal is not to fall for these informational provocations, not to trust Russian propagandists, but to trust exclusively Ukrainian mass media, Ukrainian television, Ukrainian local authorities, political and military leadership. See you.
Die Ukraine und westliche Länder widersprechen vehement. Dennoch beharrt Russland darauf, Kiew wolle eine sogenannte schmutzige, also radioaktiv verseuchte Bombe einsetzen. Russische Staatsmedien behaupten, sie sei fast fertig. Der ukrainische Präsident Zelenskyy wies die Moskauer Unterstellungen scharf zurück. In einer Videobotschaft sagte er, dass wahrscheinlich Moskau selbst einen solchen Angriff vorbereite. Auch der Westen sieht die russischen Anschuldigungen als möglichen Vorwand für eine Eskalation seines Krieges in der Ukraine. Am Sonntag hatte der russische Verteidigungsminister Shoigu mit seinem britischen und französischen und türkischen Amtskollegen telefoniert und behauptet, die Ukraine wolle die Bombe auf eigenem Gebiet abwerfen und dafür Russland verantwortlich machen. Außenminister Lavrov will den Fall jetzt vor die Vereinten Nationen bringen. Und zugeschaltet ist uns jetzt Gustav Gressel, Militärexperte, der das Geschehen in der Ukraine seit Monaten genau beobachtet. Herr Gressel, viele Beobachter im Westen glauben, dass die Russen Gerüchte über den Einsatz einer schmutzigen Bombe durch die Ukraine streuen, um dann vielleicht selbst so eine Bombe einzusetzen. Für wie wahrscheinlich halten Sie dieses Szenario?
Das ist eines der Möglichkeiten. Also Variante 1, es ist sozusagen Teil des russischen Spiels mit der Unsicherheit, um den Westen zu verunsichern, um die westlichen Öffentlichkeiten zu verunsichern, um die ganze Unterstützung für die Ukraine aus der Bahn zu bringen. Die Variante 2 ist, dass es ein Vorwand wäre für den Einsatz einer nicht strategischen Atomwaffe in der Ukraine. Ich glaube, falls es das ist, wird das erst zu einem späteren Zeitpunkt entschieden werden. Russland hat seine bisherigen Eskalationsmöglichkeiten noch nicht ausgeschöpft. Aber es ist etwas, das man in Betracht ziehen muss, leider.
Welche Folgen hätte denn der Einsatz einer solchen Bombe für die Ukraine, aber auch für den Rest Europas? Also welche Gebiete wären da betroffen, in welchem Ausmaß von der radioaktiven Verseuchung?
Das kommt sehr auf die Größe und auf die Art dieser Bombe drauf an. Man muss ja sagen, schmutzige Bomben wären reine Terrorwaffen. Sie machen militärisch überhaupt keinen Sinn. Man kann dadurch militärisch weder was gewinnen noch verlieren. Die wurden eigentlich nur im Zuge von möglichen terroristischen Anschlägen in Betracht gezogen. Und Russland scheint das jetzt irgendwie aus der Karte zu zaubern, weil ein sozusagen ukrainischer Atomwaffenanschlag oder Ähnliches irgendwie selbst Russland in der Propaganda dann zu steil wäre, wenn man sich einen Vorwand schaffen möchte, irgendetwas anzustellen. Es ist ja, die Ukraine wird ja durch die internationale Atomenergiebehörde inspiziert. Das heißt, das entsprechende Material irgendwo abzuzweigen wäre ein ziemlich schwieriges Unterfangen. Gerade in Bezug auf Endor sind ohnehin IAEA-Inspekteure im Land gewesen. Also die ganze Geschichte aus Moskau steht auf sehr tönenden Füßen, aber nur weil sie auf tönenden Füßen steht, heißt es ja nicht, dass es genügend Leute gibt, die diesem Blödsinn glauben.
Auch in der Nacht werden. Ja, auch in der Nacht zum Montag hat Russland ja wieder Gebiete in der Ostukraine beschossen. Dabei seien laut russischem Verteidigungsministerium ukrainische Stellungen bei Kupyansk und Lyman sowie nördlich von Kherson getroffen worden. Der von Russland befürchtete Großangriff auf Kherson im Südosten der Ukraine lässt derweil weiter auf sich warten. Stattdessen scheint die ukrainische Armee weiter auf eine Taktik der Nadelstiche gegen russische Truppen, Munitionsdepots und andere wichtige Infrastruktur zu setzen, auch hinter der Frontlinie. Französische Journalisten haben eine ukrainische Einheit bei einem solchen Einsatz begleitet.
Zu den ukrainischen Offensivtruppen, die hier auf Kherson vorrücken, gehört auch diese Einheit. Katania ist Ärztin und kämpft mit ihrem Mann gemeinsam an der Front. Ausgerüstet mit einem Mehrfachraketenwerfer warten die Soldaten in ihrem Versteck auf den nächsten Einsatzbefehl. Kennengelernt haben sich Katania und ihr Mann hier bei der Armee. Ich war schon einmal Kommandant in einer anderen Einheit, in die dann Katania versetzt wurde. Wir trafen uns, wir waren gemeinsam im Einsatz, wir waren zusammen. So hat das angefangen. Über das Smartphone kommt plötzlich ein Befehl vom Einsatzstab. Wir brechen sofort auf, kommen Sie mit. Der Auftrag, so schnell wie möglich eine andere Position anfahren. Ein Ziel wurde ausgemacht, eine russische Einheit in rund 19 Kilometern Entfernung. Am neuen Standort werden die Koordinaten erfasst. Wir schauen nach der richtigen Flugbahn und dann feuern wir. Katania hat die Kommunikation mit dem Stab übernommen und ist vorbereitet, falls irgendwas bei dem Angriff schief geht. Nach dem Abschuss haben die Soldaten nicht einmal 3 Minuten Zeit, um den Ort zu verlassen. Nicht vom Feind geortet zu werden, ist die einzige Chance zu überleben. In der neuen Rückzugsposition zwischen den Feldern wartet die Einheit auf das nächste Ziel. Kurze Pause für eine Erinnerung an die Hochzeit im August, für die das Paar 2 Tage Urlaub bekam. Jetzt ist es leichter für mich. Ich weiß immer, was er macht und er weiß immer, wo ich bin. Es ist wirklich besser. Ich weiß, ich kann ihr helfen, falls irgendwas passiert. Ich möchte nicht von ihr getrennt sein, an einer anderen Front und mir ständig Sorgen machen müssen. An der Frontlinie bei Kherson hat die ukrainische Armee in der vergangenen Woche mehr als 90 Ortschaften zurückerobert. Das hält die Moral in der Truppe hoch. Allerdings ist durch die massiven russischen Gegenangriffe das Internet gestört. Das macht das Vorrücken auf Kherson komplizierter. Ich hatte gehofft, dass wir Kherson schon im Sommer wieder einnehmen können. Aber ich glaube, mit Gottes Hilfe wird es noch maximal 2 Wochen dauern. Für sie wäre das eine Revanche. Als Kherson vor rund 8 Monaten an die Russen fiel, waren Katania und ihr Mann auch hier im Einsatz.
Ja, Herr Gressel, wer hat denn Ihrer Einschätzung nach an der Front in Kherson gerade die Oberhand?
Die Oberhand haben die Ukrainer. Allerdings geht der Vormarsch relativ schleppend voran. Auch wenn man sich anschaut, die Diskrepanz zwischen angekündigter Offensive und dem, was passiert, ist schon hoch. Das war aber eigentlich in Kherson immer so. Kherson wurde oft angekündigt und diente der Verschleierung von anderen Vorhaben. In dem Sinn würde es mich nicht wundern, wenn es an anderer Front jetzt mal losgehen würde oder weitergehen würde. Die ukrainischen Kräfte drücken da relativ langsam an, aber stetig.
Wir haben das ja gerade im Beitrag gesehen, Raketen abfeuern und dann ganz schnell woanders hinfahren. Wie sehr hängt denn der Erfolg der ukrainischen Truppen von solchen Hit-and-Run-Strategien ab?
Das mit jedem Artilleriesystem, also auch mit der Panzerhaubitze 2000, wird das sogenannte Shoot-and-Scoot-Verfahren angewendet. Also man bezieht einen Stellungsraum, geht einen Feuerauftrag an, verlässt die Stellung sofort und bezieht einen anderen Verfügungsraum, aus dem nie geschossen wird, sondern dann sozusagen immer rausgefahren wird, Stellungsraum beziehen und dann schießen. Das muss man gegen die russische Armee, die Artillerieortungsradare hat, die solche Feueraufträge sofort vermessen kann und dann binnen weniger Minuten Gegenfeuer auf diese Stellungen legt, auch immer anwenden. Man ist auch... Ja.
Ja, vielen Dank, Gustav Gressel. Uns rennt ein bisschen die Zeit weg, aber vielen Dank für Ihre Einschätzung.
Okay, sorry. Gern geschehen.
News about Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kherson direction made the Ukrainian front the primary subject of the discussions again. Of course, there are many questions. How quickly can Ukraine regain control of the city? Will Russia retreat as it was before, or will it fight for every stone? Should we hope for a turning point in the war? And what it takes? I'm Alexey Matsuka, and let's figure it out. Surprisingly, while information from the Ukrainian side is now quite restrained, Russians in their public posts are close to panic. Their military correspondents say that the armed forces of Ukraine are advancing from all sides and using aviation. The pro-Russian leaders turn out to Moscow requesting immediate evacuation, which at the same time should not look like an escape. They want to withdraw away from the battlefield without creating panic. And Putin suddenly returned to the idea that Crimea needs water. So now Russia has no intentions to seize Ukraine, right? In the 8th month of the war, the offensive can no longer be separate from information attack. The balance of power on the world stage and the general picture of the hostilities. Everything is closely related here, so let's see first things first. The Financial Times was the first to report that Ukraine could quickly liberate the Kherson region. The media cited some unnamed sources in the US military. The source even named the date, October the 20th. If you read that article more carefully, it becomes clear that it says about the right back part of Kherson region, not about Kherson itself. But what's the point of encircling the city if not aiming to take it? For Kyiv, this is a significant step, not only from a military point of view. If the city which Moscow solemnly declared to be Russia territory returns back to Ukraine, this will be a huge moral blow for the Kremlin. And it will be a strong signal for the Western allies. All the weapons were used for a good reason. In October, we did not have any breaking news, everything went smoothly. But Yaroslav Yanushevich, the Kherson governor, calculated that almost 36 settlements were liberated in less than a month. Ukrainian military show that the area of the liberated territories in the Kherson region has increased to 500 square kilometers. At the same time, the Russian side recognized that partial retreat of its troops. Russian Defense Ministry didn't declare it openly but indicated it on the map. They still hope that the Ukrainian counteroffensive can be stopped. After all, new generals have been appointed, I mean Surovikin and Teplinsky. So now troops in the south are in their command. Fresh faces are usually expected to show new results and carry favor. In addition, the offensive of the Ukrainian troops is no longer sudden as it was in the Kharkiv region. This time Russians were preparing for it, pulling up their reserves. It's not a secret that there is almost no optimism in the forecast for the Kremlin. The Moscow-appointed leadership of the region is asking for the evacuation of the residents to Russia, calling it a rest and study trip.
It was decided to organize the possibility of the departure of Kherson families to other regions of the Russian Federation for recreation and study. This primarily applies to the inhabitants of the right bank. We suggest all residents of the Kherson region, those who are willing to protect themselves from the consequences of the missile strikes, move to other territories. First of all, to the territory of the neighboring Crimea, Rostov, Krasnodar or Stavropol regions. Leave away and take away your children too. Vladimir Saldo, Kremlin-appointed Kherson leader.
Formally, they don't use the word evacuation, but it's not a matter of terms. Since there are talks about the leaving, according to unofficial information, the Kherson officials have already taken the first opportunity to take away their families. It might indicate possible surrender of the territory, or might mean urban combat in Kherson, which is always accompanied by civilian casualties. What are the strategic objectives of Kyiv and Moscow today? Military experts assure classic tactics could not be avoided. Ukraine needs the city of Kherson itself. After all, this will eliminate the threat to Mykolaiv and Odessa, the strategic Black Sea ports. If that's successful, Ukraine will move further along the Kherson region and part of the Zaporizhia region, accessing the isthmus of Perikop and Chongar. Thus, Ukraine will avoid direct confrontations and, if possible, urban battles. But for Russia, the southern direction is now much more important than any other. Moscow still has access to the Azov and Black Sea and a land corridor to the Crimea. Surrounding the Kherson region after holding referendums, there can cause the collapse of the core strategy when since 2014 Moscow has been trying to take a bite out Ukraine, saying that the oppressed Russians or Russian speakers can ask Russia for protection. After all this, who will believe the high-profile slogans, we always look after our own. Russia announced mobilization to hold the front line, but this step was reckless and belated. The Russians didn't have time to relocate the prepared reserve troops and transfer completely untrained soldiers in order to stop Ukraine's advance at any cost. That's why experts call the counteroffensive in the Kherson direction a new stage in the war. Battle for the city may become a turning point. From a military point of view, this is a very difficult and painful stage of the war, both for Ukraine and for Russia. Heavy losses are expected. Medusa, Russian opposition media, citing high-ranking officials, wrote about some new plans of the Russian authorities. Apparently, they want to conclude an agreement on a temporary ceasefire, and allegedly, the Russian and Ukrainian military could agree on this. The Kremlin may decide to withdraw its troops from some parts of the Kherson region.
Now, keeping Kherson is not an easy job, and the withdrawal of troops from the region can be done as a gesture of goodwill and a step towards Ukraine, one of Medusa's interlocutors close to the Kremlin assured. Medusa Daily Newsletter.
But Ukraine perceives it as Russia's trap. Putin will try to use the ceasefire to restore his army, train the mobilized men, and replenish resources in order to launch a new offensive under any pretext. For Ukraine, it's more beneficial to put the squeeze on the weakened Russian grouping in the Kherson region and gain a foothold there. Russia, on the contrary, needs to gain time until spring. In this regard, Putin's speech in Astana is worth mentioning. He said Crimea suffered from water shortage, therefore a land corridor was needed. So allegedly, they did not set a goal to destroy Ukraine.
Look at Crimea. 2.5 million people live there. They captured it and cut off the water. Our troops had to go in and turn the water on. That's just an example of the logic of our actions. If they hadn't acted, we wouldn't have reacted. Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation.
Still another version is voiced. Perhaps this is careful preparation for the people for the truce plan. Voluntarily leave the part of Kherson region but preserve a land corridor. Based on the predominant moods of the Ukrainian leadership, Kyiv will not agree to this. Perhaps we will see another gesture of goodwill. Will Russia volunteer leave the right bank of the Kherson region in order to cling to the left one with all its might? Then for the ordinary Russians it might look like Kyiv has returned its territories, but without the defeat the Russian army of the battlefield, which is so painful for the Kremlin. Moreover, the statement that we need resources mean that all the goals of Russian special military operation have disappeared. The goal of the special military operation, so-called, is to deprive Ukraine of resources, just as Russia used to do with all the post-Soviet countries. When Russia needs a military base in the Black Sea, it captures Crimea. When Crimea needs water, Russia takes the Kherson region. If Kremlin needs a land corridor, it takes Ukraine's Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk. If it needs power, it captures Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. In other words, for Russia, the internal borders of the former Soviet Union are rather conventional. Maybe that is why the president of Tajikistan has reminded Putin that the times of the Soviet Union are over and it's necessary to respect the interests of the other states. While the president of Belarus, who agreed to become Putin's close ally, doesn't know how to get out of this trap now. It's also important to understand the timing. The armed forces of Ukraine say that in order to avoid huge losses and destruction of infrastructure, control will be regained gradually. After all, Russia's military warehouses, logistics and command posts are targeted almost every day. This tactic is aimed at avoiding head-to-head battles. The former intelligence chief of the Finnish General Staff has quite accurately described the possibility strategy in the Kherson region.
I have already learned that when it comes to Ukrainians, there is nothing impossible. They are quite experienced and know how to take the advantage of any situation. If the Ukrainians find a gap, they will use it. Major General Pekka Toveri, former intelligence chief of the Finnish General Staff.
Will the Russian army fight or retreat? Another important factor is that this part of the front is defended by Russia's newly mobilized troops. This suggests that Moscow still plans to resist. But on the other hand, the Kremlin has not concentrated its elite units near Kherson. Well, the chances that the Russian army can retreat are increasing, but the opinion that Russia will continue to fight cannot be cast aside. It will be a war of attrition, then Russians can do it to drag out time. In addition, they rely on winter cold and power outages. They have intensified the attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, while Western air defense systems have not been obtained yet. After all, when using drones, they try to exhaust both Ukraine and the West financially. The cost of a drone and the cost of a missile for downing it are just disproportionate. But these are the new challenges, this is a new stage. Battle for Kherson seems to be the last episode of not a hybrid but a traditional war, when everything is decided not in the high offices but on the battlefield by the military themselves, when the result depends not only on the equipment but also on the desire to fight. What would happen? We will discuss it in our new episodes on UA TV channel. Thank you for watching. See you next video.